want you to think on that a minute. You, black man and black woman, had 700,000 books in one library. That's not talking about all your libraries now. When no one else in the world had them. And you were writing them on paper, while even in Babylon, which was a highly developed civilization, they were still doing it on clay tablets. And you cannot store clay tablets as well as you can paper books. You were doing that with pen and ink. In Babylon, they had to inscribe it on wax, put it in the oven, and cook it. All you had to do was dip in pen and ink and write it. That was a great step in the development of the civilizing of man, the art of writing. In fact, it was worshipped. For a long time, man has a tendency to worship everything. What Aristotle could not understand, because he stole that which he could reasonably understand, and he put all these different names of people, many of them there's no historical existence for. There is not even a genetic record of them, not even a birth record. But he put the names of his friends and other people on these books and took African theology out of Africa, and it became what was misnomered as Greek philosophy, which you'll find in Stolen Legacy by Dr. George G.M. James. We'll be studying in very deeply as we go. What he could not steal, when he couldn't steal it all, what did he do? Destroyed it. There began the burning of books. And throughout the history of Europe, I'm not being a racist or much, I'm just telling you history now. I have to be careful to do that because black folks think you're being a racist and won't listen to you, see. But history is history. I mean, the true story, our story, must be told. And they have had a fetish with burning up books, because when they first came into Africa, they were not looking for books. They were not looking for art. They were looking for what? Food, gold, wealth, whatever they could find. Mostly food, because it was hard making it up there in Europe. And at that time, Kemet was the breadbasket of the world. It was feeding the whole Mediterranean area. Just right there, just right here, in this area, was feeding the whole area of the world right there. As far over in Greece. This is where the food source is coming from, in the land of the blacks. Well, now, I want to show you something here. I want to read it for you. And while I'm reading, after I read this, I'm going to pass it around for you to share with one another. Please send it back. This is one book I really believe you should have. I'm very fascinated by it. And it's a classical piece. It's African History by Les Edmond and Earl Sweeting. It has a lot of artist conceptions in it that are beautiful. But here, let me read from it, and then I'll show it to you. It'll give you some kind of depiction of what your library looked like. When we speak of the literature of a nation, we mean such literatures as may be stored in a library and possessed by individuals. In a word, we mean books. The Egyptians were the first people of the ancient world. The what? Of the ancient world who had a literature of this kind, who wrote books and read books, who possessed books and loved books. You walking around here today up in the TV all the time, don't want to read anything unless it's a love novel, and here you once loved books. You relished books. In fact, in one of our empires, books were more valuable than gold. They would rather sell you their house than sell you their books. That's how valuable they were. And if my house was burning down, the first thing after my wife and my children would be my books. And their literature, which grew and flourished and decayed with the language in which it was written, was of the most varied character, scientific, secular, and religious. Some of these writings are older than the pyramids. Some are as recent as the time when Egypt had fallen from her high estate and become a Roman province. Between these two extremes lie more than 4,000 years. The picture shows the interior of an ancient library with scrolls on the shelves with little white tags for title and author because they catalog them. I will begin to my left. Please pass it around and you will see what your library used to look like. He says 5,000 years. I say over 18,000 years because Dr. Ben says that the book of the coming forth by day and by night, which you can trace the Bible and every other holy book back to, and we'll be getting heavy into that as we go. He says they were doing a revision of it 10,000 before the Christian era. It wasn't being written, it was being revised. So this literature, the idea of writing and literature has been around for quite some time. Dr. Williams, Destruction of Black Civilization, page 95, in relationship to this same subject. Dr. Williams says on page 95 of the Destruction of Black Civilization, here, scholars from foreign lands came to study, that here he's talking about as what? Egypt. Came to study. And from here, religious ideas, what kind? And architectural designs spread abroad. The early Greeks and Romans eagerly copied from both, reshaped them, and made them integral parts of an quote-unquote original Western culture. What Dr. Williams is saying here is there is no Western culture as such, because these things are reshaped and revised from African culture. During periods of decline or conquest, Europe and Asia seized and transported from Africa as much of the artifacts of its civilization as they could. Cambyses, for example, as early as the 6th century BC, he was a Persian, hauled away over $100 million of precious historical material from Thebes, the mother of cities, who we'll be talking about later, the oldest city in the world. From Thebes alone was stolen by the Persians over $100 million. Think about $100 million, brothers and sisters, worth of educational materials and books was stolen out of Africa. On just this one trip, $100 million worth of historical material. Cambyses was only one of the countless thousands who invaded the tomb repositories of black history during each of the many periods of foreign invasions and foreign rule. Ancient Kemet was invaded by over 15 major nations, not to mention all the other little nations that used to come in and try to get them some of that piece of that big plum that was sitting there. And so, as Van Sertima says, after taking it all, hiding it, and you will find it in his libraries and museums all over the world, as Dr. Williams and Joel A. Rogers said, in order to study our history, you must first go to Europe, because that's where it is. Much of it you will not find on the continent. Most of it you will not find on the continent. You will have to go to places outside of the continent to get it, because why? It was taken out. After they took it out, they said, what have you ever done? Where is your writing? You should serve us because you haven't done anything. And it is in serving us that you will learn how to do something. That's why this history is so important, because our children are programmed to that. That they must follow what white society, this European society here in America, has established as the norm for being an intellectual, as the norm for being truly educated. So much so that they have them coming out of school sounding more like white folks than white folks do. Talking just like them. And when you do that, you have destroyed a part of your very soul and spirit. When you, the phonetic sounds and the method of communicating which was given to you by the Creator, you have divested yourself of that. So you have divested yourself of your true being. You are killing yourself. You are becoming invisible simply because you believe, and that is why our people can stand up and say, why should I study black history? I mean, that happened in the past because we believe that we have none. This fellow that runs around on television intimidating white folks, and because they like to be intimidated sometimes. But they will define how and when you will intimidate them. Because they love the 60s when we said black power gonna get you, whitey. They got jollies off of that. And when they got tired of that fad, say that's enough of that. Because we have the material to wipe you out. And to show you that we're tired, we're going to lock up every one of your leaders and run whatever one we get out of the country and kill the others. But for a while, they were entertained by it. They really had sexual fantasies wrapped up in it. But we'll talk about that when we get into European psychosexual maladjustment. That's a whole subject that we'll be covering later. And a white man wrote about this, by the way, so you don't think I'm making it up. But after all of this, now, we are brought to think that so this man, let me get back to it, this, what was it, on the age, the 18, whatever it is, I don't watch it, but he'll be around. This white reporter was asking him about African History Month, or Black History Month, as they call it, quote unquote. And he said, I don't see why they're making such a big deal out of it. I mean, it's just not that important to me. You know why? Because he thinks that his history begins with slavery. Everything he wears on him, the gold chain is supposed to be a symbol of it. I don't want any chains that is a symbol of slavery, gold or otherwise. But it's a symbol of slavery. Perhaps if he knew of his true history, that he is the beginning of all history, it starts with him, he may not take such a poor assessment of the study of it. Perhaps. And this is one of the things we must convey to our children and our people especially. I had the privilege of speaking to a group of children in public school and as Brother Hanif and Sister Hanifa do often, I hear. And it's just a joy to see how black children receive this and can give it back to you just the way you give it to them. They will absorb this. So we are now in a great position, probably the best we have been in since we have been taken captive here. We can recapture not only the knowledge of what we have done, quote-unquote, black achievements in America, but we can go back to the beginning of time itself and reclaim that history and give it to our children and say, now, you have to be the best because you started out as the best. And so you have to do what Jesse Jackson said. You must be excellent because it is a mandate from Almighty God that you be that, for he made you that way in the beginning. It started that way. You cannot fall short of that. Now, inculcating that idea may help to bring them back from the madness of self-destruction they seem to be headed into. Forgive me for being so emotional about this, but this is my heart and soul. And I have to stop in the midst of the history and get into the philosophy of it as well. Now, I mentioned before when I was here, and we'll be coming to it again, I'm sure, but I'm going to gloss over it now, that one of the reasons why the African, we can say that the Bible began in Africa, is because all paper began in Africa. For over 3,000 years, Africans dominated the paper industry. If you wanted a piece of paper, you had to go to black people to get it, in short, in a word. That's how you got paper in those days. Now, in dealing with the name Egypt, the misnomer Egypt, I need to go to several of our heavyweight scholars, Dr. Ben for one, and Dr. Williams once again. Dr. Yusuf Benjo-Chanaman, my man, black man of the Nile and his family. Page 3. Dr. Ben, the man who reads walls at top speed. He reads walls and coffins and poles and pillars and all kind of stuff. He can read the writing, the handwriting on the wall. The indigenous Africans of ancient Sumeria, this is the name, this is one of the names. These are several names for what the Greeks misnomered Egypt. Yeah. And I'll tell you how they came to that name, Egypt, as we go on. If I forget to, please remind me. The indigenous Africans of ancient Temeri, that is, he gives several other names. Kemet, this is another spelling. Kemet, Sais, was different names it was called at different times and in different geographical locations in ancient Kemet itself. I'll tell you why I prefer Kemet. Dr. Ben prefers Temeri. I prefer it because when I go to Dr. Williams in The Destruction of Black Civilization, page 68, he gives me a key as to why it was referred to as Kemet. He says this: the Greek contribution was the greatest in terms of anybody who did, while invading us, also did contribute something. Now, they didn't contribute much, but it was better than any other contribution that any European or Asian had made once they came into Africa. They always came in and took something out. One thing the Greeks did is once they got there, they came to realize that there was something of value here. That just having to keep coming back and invading them and fight them again only maximizes our risk. One of the ways we can minimize our risk in this endeavor is to take control of their institutions. And we'll find out which was the first institution they had to take control of Africa as we move on. But he said they did come in and try to, even after destroying our institutions, even though they set it up in their own name and their own image, at least some of the information was retained. The others just took it out completely. That's why he's saying that their contribution was the greatest. And he's doing that under the heading of the external influence myth that Egypt developed, or Kemet developed, to such a high level of civilization because it was influenced by the Asians, influenced by the Greeks and everyone else. He said, well, that is not so. But if someone did give it some influence, it was minimal, and the ones who did that were the Greeks. He goes on to say it was accidental, one of those accidents of history that turn out to be highly important. In this case, the Greeks unwittingly applied the second name of the city of Menes. Who is Menes? I've raised another name now. Somebody tell me? No. That's commonly thought of in Egyptology. He was the pharaoh who united the two lands again. Reunited the two lands about 3,500 before the Christian era. And his name was Menes, or others call it Nama. Dr. Finn prefers Nama. A statement that is used today. Which I believe means he will make it happen, or he makes it happen. Reunited the two lands around 3,500 before the Christian era, because we have found tombs of pharaohs that are much older than this, who had once united both the lands. In fact, the first pharaoh of Egypt, what came to be known as Egypt, that we know of thus far was Osiris. And it was Osiris and his wonderful, fine, black wife named Isis, the mother of all, who around 18,000 before the Christian era, and as I go on, I believe I'm going to be reading directly from a document giving you that information, who founded the colony of Kemet, who were Cushites who founded that colony. Well, let me get off Osiris because we'll do a whole study on him later and get back to Dr. Williams' statement now. He says that this city of Menes, or Menes, which the Greeks pronounced Memphis, what you must understand is the Greeks couldn't pronounce our language very well. So they would always corrupt it into how they spoke. That's why they couldn't pronounce the K sound, so they put a C to everything. So now we have Memphis, what it's called, this city established by Menes, and this is what they were calling Menes, and they corrupted it into the word A-I-G-Y-P-T-O-S, Egyptos. And they applied this name, Egyptos, which should have been, this is what they were trying to pronounce. They were trying to pronounce Menes or Nama when they said Memphis, the city of Memphis. But the city of Memphis was dedicated to Ptah, the god Ptah. Now I will explain to you as we go on what these gods and goddesses were. They were not what you are told, that we worship a whole lot of gods and goddesses. Some of us had degenerated to that level. But these gods and goddesses were scientific symbols which explain natural phenomena. When we get into the mystery system, which we will study what the Ptah principle was. But for right now, this city was dedicated to that principle of science, the Ptah principle, and it was called Hekupta, city of the god Ptah, or house of the god Ptah, or house of the Ptah principle. When we get into the Ptah principle, you'll see why that was such an important name for a city. The science involved in it. This is what Menes called the city. But the Greeks couldn't say that. So they called it Aegyptus. And this is how we get the word Egypt and how Egypt came about. But it was the name of a city, and they named the whole land because they hadn't explored. They didn't know the whole land at that time. They hadn't traveled in all of Egypt. There was a lot to Egypt. They had to cover a lot of territory. They had not covered that territory, so they thought the area which they had come in contact with at the time was what they would call the whole land. It was their reference. For Memphis was also called, that's right, he had the spelling here, Kupta, or the mansion of the house of Ptah, the god protector of the city. From the Greek Egyptos, Memphis became Egypt, and Egypt became the name of the two lands extending from the Mediterranean to the first cataract, because at that time, brothers and sisters, at that time, their empire had once spread all over here into the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia. Is where your empire had spread at that time. The Asians had taken much of the land, and Menes was in the process of taking it back. He had to go all the way to the Mediterranean, or as it was called, the Sea of Kemet at that time, the Kemetan Sea. Later the Greeks called it the Egyptian Sea, before he could advance on to take back the lands which the Asians had invaded. So what is called Asia, or the Near East, was a part of your empire of ancient Kemet then. There was no Egypt before the black king from whose name it was indirectly derived. Before that, the country was called Chem, and Dr. Williams spelled it C-H-E-M, or Chem-Ming, from which we get the word what? From which we get the word chemistry. And he said it was another name indicating its black inhabitants and not the color of the soil. Because European scholars will tell you, well, it meant the color of the black soil on the Nile River. But it did not mean that. It was a description of the people from that land, Chem, which gives us the word chemistry. So brothers and sisters, there's so many things that you look at in the world today that are constant reminders of the greatness that was once yours, and the greatness that can be yours again. So when your children go to school and you go to school, you shouldn't be wrestling with chemistry. It was your subject in the beginning. It is named after you. Chemistry. Whenever I see one of those commercials on television that says, we need chemicals, where they're trying to sell the world all these drugs in the food, without chemicals there would be no life. Now, strictly speaking, scientifically, that's true, but those are natural chemicals from the earth. For any combination of ingredients from the earth becomes a what? Chemical. And the black man fits that more than any other man. Why? Brother Shaka, are you being racist? Why, my brother?
Because all of the components of his body come from a black soul and cannot be found in the white form.
That's right. All of the chemical elements, potassium, magnesium, oxide, this, all of ferrous oxide, everything, every chemical which makes up the human body, and they are many, can only be found in its total composition in the black earth. They cannot be found in sand, not even in red clay. That is why farmers prefer land that is dark and rich, because it will produce the greatest soil. You know, the Creator knew what he was doing. The scripture says, and he created man from the dust of the earth, and man became a living soul. And the man's name was Adam, according to that story. And the word Adam comes from the Akkadian word Aduma, child of black clay. Now, Josephus, Flavius Josephus, don't worry because we'll come back to his name again. Flavius Josephus and some others tried to say that the word Adam meant red man. True. But red in those days, in reference to people, was used to describe a very dark people, because from the word theomix, which the Greeks called the Canaanites, who we will find out as we go on were undoubtedly black people, they called them theomix, which was red-purple, or in essence, mahogany-colored people, is what they were. So even when you say it was red, you're leaving out something. But the Akkadian said it was a child of black clay. So I just wanted to reflect on that a minute. That you are the essence of the life that even keeps the earth moving. And it was the Creator who designed it that way. There's no curse on you. We'll deal with that Ham legend when we come to it. There's no curse on you. Now, any curse on you is one you bring on yourself. Any curse on you is one that you bring on yourself. So the right social and moral development, the right social and moral development did not come from the Hebrews, but through the Hebrews. So the Hebrews, although they made a major contribution now in sustaining it, they were the ones who kept it moving around once our land had been invaded. We were cut off from our values and culture and knowledge. One of the reasons why the Bible is so important is because it is that gateway. They kept that part of it circulating, but it was limited from their own particular historical experience in the world at that time. The Hebrews, who were originally Africans, which I'm going to pile evidence on top of evidence on top of evidence. I think you'll get tired of it. But you will know this, and you will be able to discuss it with anyone with certainty that the Hebrews were indeed African people. And we come to that point in our study. But this correct, which the Bible is supposed to be the moral guide, we're supposed to draw our morality and social behavior from the Bible, right? Said those systems that are expressed in the Bible as such came first from the Africans in Kemet, for they founded those laws which govern the world and the universe. We will study that as we go on. And do you know, there is one statement that is eternal among the Africans. There are many, and this is one of them, that is written all over the walls of his temples, and many of them took it in their coffins with them when they died. Was written these words when you go in the land of Kemet and look outside the walls of the great temples, which were the universities of that time. You will see written in stone the words, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Jesus had to say that because he came in the line of teachers and prophets who date all the way back to Osiris. And this is what Osiris taught. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is the basis of all social behavior. Now, in a land where the people are xenophilic, you can do that. Xenophilic meaning having love of other peoples. In a land where people are xenophobic or ruled by xenophobes, that's people who have fear of other people who are different from them. I guess you have an idea who I'm talking about. Feel they must subject them. You cannot practice that. Because, as Brother Malcolm says, you're not talking the same language. You may do unto him as you would have him do unto you, but he's going to do you in. So you have to realize now, I am dealing with an enemy force, and I'm not saying that to be racist. I didn't create that situation. But if I know you're out to get me, I'd be a fool not to protect myself. So I may be able to open myself up to this brother or this sister because they're trying to live according to a value system which says, I'm going to do to you, my brother, what I would want you to do to me. I wouldn't hurt you, so don't hurt me. So I can open up to him and live that way. I can feel relatively safe. In fact, you can sleep in a community like that with no knock on your door. But when you have someone who you cannot, whose behavior you cannot predict, or somewhat you can reasonably predict it, or who has a worldview which says everything I can take and keep and hold and redefine is morally correct for me to do, then how you going to do unto him as you would have him do unto you? So this is one of the problems. Why am I spending time on this? This is one of the problems of black people in our approach to life. It's good, it's ideal. Would to the Lord that we could do this with everybody. First, I'd like to see us practice it with one another. That's where you start first. I'd like to see us practice, but there's a lot of us you cannot practice that with because we have too many of them other folk in us. So we have allowed the negative which is in us to come to the fore. And that means that you even have to be careful with them. But you seek to always do right by others. But you never allow anyone to take advantage of you. And one of the first things that the European will say in lands that he dominates and controls, and people he dominates and controls, when they begin to shake him off of their shoulders and say, look, we want our own, we want to be independent, we want to define our own destiny, he begins to say to them, but you black man, you man of color, believe that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, so love me. Don't be a racist in reverse. Love me. And if you love me, you will let me do what I want to you. That's his definition of love. Well, a fox loves sheep. But I don't think the sheep wants that kind of love. That's a funny kind of love. And you don't want it. So at the basis of all religion, all religious philosophy, before you get into all the intricate doctrinal aspects and all the different prophets and saviors and so forth which have come to the earth, or people say have come to the earth, at the basis of all religious doctrine is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which was first created by the African. So now we see that the Bible comes to us, as the document says, not from the Hebrews, but through them, and was created first in the land of the blacks. Document 2. The entire Psalms and the Hebrew Torah, I will read it and then we'll analyze it. That is the Christian and Old Testament, the Hebrew Torah, are reeked with direct copies of works written word for word from the African, and as Dr. Ben says, Egyptian, Nubian, Cushite, Ethiopian in parentheses. Direct word for word from the African sayings and teachings. This should not be surprising to anybody, since Moses and most of the earliest Hebrews in Genesis and Exodus were all Africans, They were born in Egypt and Ethiopia. Even the theory of monotheism, the belief of one God above all others, was taught in Egypt before the birth of Moses. Now, this is going to take us on an adventure, my brothers and sisters. What is the word you think is the key to taking us on our exploratory adventure? Huh? No, that we found in this document. Monotheism, that's right. That is the word that will take us on our journey. Let's work to that word now, for there's several other key words in this document. This is how we research when we research. We'll go into a document, and one word could send you on a course of study that could last weeks or months. You could write a whole book around it. That's how involved research can become. Just that one terminology. First of all, Dr. Ben tells us, that's taken from Black Man of the Nile, page 72, by Dr. Yusuf Benjachanan. He tells us that the Psalms and the Hebrew Torah, and the Psalms especially, are taken word for word from African writings, and we will show the comparison of that when we get to lesson 4 in this series, which probably I think comes up in seminar 1C. But one I will mention here is Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun. Is almost exactly word for word as I believe, don't quote me on this because I'll have to give it to you in my notes when we get to that subject later on. I believe it's Psalms 119, I'm not sure. But it's one of the Psalms of David which are almost word for word with Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun. And I will show the comparison between the two and bring both of those documents with me when we study that, I believe in seminar 1C. The Torah is a word, a Hebrew word, which refers to the first 5 books of the Bible. First 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They are reportedly written by Moses. We will examine that. We will question that. You can draw your conclusions from our findings when we get into this, about them being written by Moses. But that is to be discussed a little later on, the Torah. But I wanted you to know what the word meant. The word testament, because you notice he mentions Old Testament here. The Old Testament, the word testament was not even used. You think that when Moses was writing, or Isaiah the prophet, or Daniel the prophet was writing, they said, let's write the books of the Old Testament. No, they didn't. You think in the days that the Gospels were being written, the biography of the life of Jesus by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they said, let's write a New Testament. No, they did not. The concept of using the terminology testament to distinguish between the history of the Hebrews, which is contained in the Old Testament, and the history of the Christian church, which is contained, or the early Christian church, which is contained in the New Testament, came from an African who was one of the founders of the African church, an African church father whose name is Tertullian. And Tertullian lived circa date now 155 to 230 CE of the Christian era. And the word testament comes from the Greek diatheke. You'll find whenever you get in the New Testament, there's an awful lot of Greek words. And I'll explain why that is as we go on in our study. It means a covenant, contract, or agreement is what diatheke meant. And to Tertullian, the bishop of Carthage, which is in Africa, here, in this area in Africa, Carthage, it was the African church. It was not the Roman church. The Roman church had not risen into power yet. Africans were still in control of Christianity. And it was this African saint Bishop of Carthage, who suggested that the Bible should be divided into two sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Agreement and the New Agreement. Because the New Testament had just recently come into being a few years before the birth of Tertullian in Africa. We will get into the study of that in depth, but I'll just mention the man responsible for it was John Marcion. He did not want there to exist an Old Testament at all because he said the God of the Old Testament was just too mean and cruel for him. The only one he could accept was the lowly Jesus, the sweet and tender God. So he said, I think we should get rid of that book because that belongs primarily to the Jews, to the Hebrews, and we should develop a Christian literature. And later on, it became known as the New Testament. We'll go into the history of how that developed later. The other man to come along and corroborate the concept of applying the term diatheke, or testament, as a division between the Hebrew Bible and the New Christian Bible, Christian scriptures, was a man named Origen. Origen lived circa date 185-254 of the Christian era. He was also an African bishop who wrote over 6,000 publications. The brother had a very fluid mind, very productive in his time. Unfortunately, he was also the African who was responsible for almost single-handedly giving the African church over to the Romans. It was this Tertullian who decided that Latin should become the language of the church, when it should have been the Punic language, the language spoken by the Carthaginians, because the church was now in Africa and most of its scholarly work was either carried on in one of two places. It was carried on in Carthage here in northern Africa, or it was carried on in Egypt here, in Kemet and Alexandria, or it was carried on by the Coptic Church in Ethiopia. Those were the three places that scholarly development of Christianity was going on before the Romans co-opted it and redefined it and molded it in their image. Because you will find that the original African concept of Christianity and the life of Christ is very different from that which was later developed by Europeans, or co-opted or reinterpreted by Europeans. These two names out of our history, Tertullian and Origen, are responsible for calling it the Old and New Testament. And as regards the language, Latin language, it was the one language that was allowed to be used to translate the Bible and for the scholarly translations of works throughout Europe for many, many centuries. All other language, German, French, English, was considered to be vulgar. To walk in church and speak English was a sacrilege. Even the King of England had to speak Latin while he was in church. And it was of blood, Tertullian, who established Latin, because Latin was a composite, a hybrid language of so many of the languages that had come out of Africa and also the languages which existed in the Mediterranean area. It was a composite of Greek, it was a composite of Phoenician language and many others, which helped to make up Latin. And that may be one of the reasons why Tertullian chose it as the language of the Christian church, because they were trying to tell a universal church to convert the world. That may have been one reason. Similar to the reason why we choose Swahili, because of all of the African languages, Swahili is the most what? International. Now, brothers and sisters, we have to move to, because we will be talking about Moses a little later. And I did discuss with you, I believe, when I was here before at the lecture, that Abraham came from Ur of Chaldea, which was in Mesopotamia. All right, so we will study that in detail later. Since I had mentioned it before, I need not discuss it at this point. What we want to go to now is the word monotheism. 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 The word mono meaning theism, meaning the one God concept, as opposed to poly.